Sasha Merrill had already fallen when Gideon Baxter stopped moving. Not from shock, not from confusion. He had been watching the air move wrong for the past 2 hours, and the moment her knees buckled beneath the podium lights, something inside him shifted from alert to certain. He set down the thermos he had been carrying through the eastern corridor, lowered himself to one knee beside the nearest ventilation register, and held the back of his hand against the grill. The current was warm. It should not have been warm. Around him, the gala erupted. 300 donors, board members, government officials, and senior physicians scrambled toward the stage. Security personnel shouted into radios. A board member knocked over a centerpiece trying to reach the fallen chief medical officer. 2 nurses who had been standing near the catering station pressed their palms to their temples and swayed without understanding why. Gideon watched the room the way a man watches a fire he already knows the shape of. He was 42 years old, lean and quiet, with close-cropped dark hair, and the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from practice. He wore a Navy security uniform that had been washed too many times, a visitor's lanyard tucked into his breast pocket from when he had checked on Vera earlier that evening, and a personal CO detector clipped to his belt beneath his jacket, a habit left over from 11 years as a fire investigator that he had never been able to break. The reading on the detector was climbing. Gideon had not planned to be the kind of man anyone noticed tonight. He was 3 months into a contract security position at Rosedale Memorial Hospital, working night shifts while Vera, his 8-year-old daughter, recovered from her second corrective heart surgery on the 4th floor. The arrangement was practical and painful in equal measure. He could check on her during rounds, be present without being absent, and keep paying the bills that a child's long hospitalization quietly multiplied. He had learned to move through the hospital without drawing attention to himself. Large buildings full of important people rarely noticed the man making sure the exits were clear. But that morning, during his first walkthrough of the newly completed Hartwell cardiac wing before the gala setup began, Gideon had noticed something that did not belong. The temporary electrical junction boxes installed to power, the event lighting had been mounted along the west wall of the sub-corridor running beneath the main function hall. The grounding connections on 2 of the boxes were loose, not dangerously loose by the standard of someone who had never watched a building fill with smoke from a fault no one caught in time, but loose enough. The insulation behind the wall panels in that corridor was the older fiber type, the kind that smoldered slowly and produced carbon monoxide long before it produced visible flame. Combined with the main HVAC return intake positioned at the base of the same wall, the setup created a path for contaminated air to be drawn directly into the function hall above. Gideon had submitted his first written warning to the operations system at 7:43 in the morning. He had flagged the junction boxes, identified the intake proximity, and requested that the event be delayed until a certified electrician re-inspected the grounding. Hugh Fenwick had appeared before anyone from facilities returned his call. The hospital's chief executive was a tall man with silver hair and a suit that managed to look expensive without announcing it. He had the composed manner of someone who had spent decades making difficult things sound reasonable. He listened to Gideon for less than a minute before his expression settled into something between impatience and dismissal. Tonight's event was the culmination of a 4-year fundraising campaign. The Hartwell family, whose donation had made the cardiac wing possible, were flying in from Calgary. 2 provincial cabinet ministers were confirmed. A national broadcaster was live streaming the dedication ceremony. Hugh reminded Gideon with the tone of a man explaining arithmetic to a child that a security guard's concern about grounding connections was not the same as an engineer's assessment. The electricians contracted for the installation had signed off. The event would proceed. Gideon asked whether he could speak to the contracted electricians directly. Hugh told him to return to his post. The second warning went into the system at 9:15, the third at 11:40, after Gideon discovered that the HVAC dampers controlling airflow into the function hall had been manually adjusted to increase circulation, pulling more air from the sub-corridor, not less. He documented each submission with timestamps and attached photographs from his phone. He attempted to reach the fire warden, the duty facilities manager, and the on-call safety officer. 2 did not respond. The third told him the event was already approved through senior administration and that any safety concerns had been reviewed. Gideon went to check on Vera at noon. She was small in the hospital bed with a book open across her lap and the particular expression she wore when she was pretending to read but actually listening to the hallway. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's habit of studying a room before deciding to trust it. She had been in and out of Rosedale Memorial for 3 years, and she had long ago stopped being afraid of the machines or the sounds. What still made her quietly anxious, Gideon knew, was when he came to see her and worked too hard at appearing relaxed. She asked him if everything was okay downstairs. He told her the gala was very loud and very full of important people. She said that did not answer her question. He smiled at that. He adjusted the book in her lap and promised he would come back before midnight. She asked whether he had eaten lunch. He had not. She handed him a granola bar from the drawer of her bedside table with the seriousness of someone managing a difficult employee, and he ate it in the corridor while the CO detector in his pocket read a number that had not gone down since morning. By the time the gala opened, the function hall was lit in soft gold and filled with the careful noise of people who understood they were being watched and approved of it. Sasha Merrill entered to sustained applause. The hospital's chief medical officer was not a woman who commanded rooms through volume. She was measured and precise, with the manner of someone who had spent 20 years making life-and-death decisions without the luxury of theatrics. She stepped to the podium in a dove-gray blazer and began her remarks about what the Hartwell Cardiac Wing would mean for families who arrived at Rosedale with nowhere else to go. Gideon stood near the rear service corridor and watched the ventilation registers. The first symptoms appeared within 40 minutes. A member of the catering staff paused beside a linen trolley and stood too still for too long. A board member near the center table lost the thread of a conversation and rubbed the back of his neck. A physician Gideon recognized from the cardiology department, attending tonight as a guest, coughed into his hand, glanced at the man beside him, and coughed again. Gideon's detector crossed the warning threshold. He moved toward the HVAC control panel in the service alcove. 2 event security staff stepped in front of him. He identified himself, showed his hospital credentials, and explained that the air quality in the function hall was deteriorating. One of them asked whether he had authorization from senior administration. The other told him the event was live. On the stage, Sasha stopped speaking. It was a small pause, a fraction of a second where her eyes found the middle distance and the sentence she had been forming seemed to dissolve. She gripped the edge of the podium. She tried to continue. Her shoulders moved sideways by a degree that no one would have caught unless they had been watching very carefully. Then she went down. The hall fractured. Physicians surged toward the stage. Board members rose from their chairs. Cameras turned. Hugh Fenwick's voice cut across the noise, ordering security to control the perimeter and instructing someone to cut the broadcast. Another guest stumbled sideways into a chair and did not get up. Gideon was already moving when a hand closed around his arm from behind. He turned. The man was large, well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal suit with a red pin on the lapel identifying him as a Hartwell Foundation donor. It was Darius Okonkwo, and for a single moment, recognition and disbelief crossed his face simultaneously, the way they do when a person appears somewhere that makes no sense until it suddenly makes every kind of sense. Darius Okonkwo was a sergeant with the Peel Regional Police. He had attended tonight as a Foundation supporter, not in any official capacity. He released Gideon's arm almost as quickly as he had grabbed it. The composure in his face broke, and what replaced it was something rawer. The particular desperation of a man watching a situation collapse around someone he cannot protect the way his instincts are demanding he protect her. He asked Gideon to help her. Gideon was already past him, crossing the floor toward the stage. Hugh Fenwick stepped directly into his path. The chief executive looked at Gideon's uniform and then at the guests collapsing in clusters across the hall, and his expression did not shift into fear so much as tightened into a kind of rigid refusal to acknowledge what was happening. He said that Gideon was a contract security officer without the authority to interfere with medical staff or interrupt an active emergency response. He said it quietly and with great precision, as though the problem in front of him was a procedural one. Gideon looked at the physician who had just prepared an epinephrine injector without confirmation of Sasha's actual condition. He stepped around Hugh. He called across the room that the hall was being contaminated through the HVAC system. Carbon monoxide. The electrical junction boxes in the sub-corridor were overheating the insulation. The CO was being drawn into the function hall through the return intake. This was not a cardiac event. This was not an isolated collapse, it was the air. The physicians nearest the stage stared at him. Hugh told 2 security officers to remove him. Darius Okonkwo moved faster than either of them. He did not touch Gideon. He simply placed himself beside him, and the 2 security officers looked at the size of the man and the certainty in his face and stopped. Darius gave 4 instructions in the voice he used when a situation had already passed the point of debate. Open every emergency exit, shut down the HVAC entirely, keep people away from the loading bay corridor near the sublevel, and locate every portable oxygen unit in the building. He said them to Gideon, not to the room. He was not in command tonight, he was listening. One of the physicians at Sasha's side demanded to know who Gideon was. Darius answered without looking away from the stage. 5 years ago, a warehouse fire in Brampton, deteriorated wiring in a storage facility, 2 firefighters and a police officer trapped inside a collapsed section. Gideon had been the fire investigator who came in after the first responders and found them in the smoke before the structural team broke through the debris. He had identified the inhalant by smell and symptom, positioned each of them for conscious recovery, and told the paramedics exactly what treatment to prioritize before they had finished pulling out their equipment. Darius had been the police officer. He had never fully explained to anyone why he still attended the fundraising galas for Rosedale Memorial's cardiac camp every year. The room knew now. The brief silence that followed was not reverence. It was the specific stillness of people recalibrating. Gideon climbed onto the stage. The physician who had prepared the epinephrine was reaching for Sasha's arm again. Gideon caught his wrist before the needle made contact and asked him to check her pulse first. The physician pulled back, began to object, then checked. The pulse was there, faint, irregular, but present. Her heart had not stopped. The arrhythmia on the portable monitor was oxygen deprivation, responding to the muscles, not a primary cardiac event. Epinephrine administered to a heart still beating under CO poisoning could destabilize a rhythm that no amount of subsequent intervention would recover. No one in the room challenged him again. He positioned Sasha's airway, fitted the oxygen mask from the nearest emergency kit, and spoke to the medical team in the same tone he used when walking Vera through something frightening, direct, unhurried, exactly 1 step ahead of the fear rather than behind it. He assigned roles, 1 physician monitoring the pulse continuously, 1 adjusting the oxygen flow, 1 watching her pupils and reporting any change. He kept the defibrillator within reach and told them clearly, not unless her pulse disappeared completely. Darius had already begun the evacuation. He moved through the room section by section, keeping the flow controlled. People upright, walking, not running, not creating the secondary danger of a crowd folding in on itself. The emergency exits along the north and south walls swung open, and cold November air pushed in from the street. Sharp, clean, immediate. Several guests who had been swaying visibly straightened the moment it reached them. A caterer who had been sitting slumped against the wall managed to stand. Hugh Fenwick remained near the stage, demanding updates from anyone who would listen and giving instructions to no one with the authority to act on them. Gideon looked at him once, briefly, then looked back at Sasha. Her breathing was too shallow. The monitor showed a slow deterioration, each cycle slightly less effective than the one before. The physician on pulse duty said it aloud without being asked. Weakening. The oxygen mask was in place, but passive delivery was not reaching what her body needed. Gideon removed the mask. He repositioned her head with care. He tilted her chin, confirmed the airway, and began breathing for her while the second physician maintained the oxygen supply. He counted the intervals internally, not from training recalled under stress, but from the bone-deep habit of someone who had learned long ago that calm is not the absence of fear. It is what you do instead of showing it. The physicians around the stage stopped speaking over each other. They followed his timing. Darius stood nearby with his hands at his sides, unable to help with what was happening on the stage and experienced enough not to pretend otherwise. After what felt to everyone watching like far longer than it was, Sasha's body responded. A sharp, involuntary breath, a cough. Another breath, ragged and thin, but her own. Gideon replaced the mask immediately and kept one hand at the side of her face, watching the movement of her chest until 2 complete cycles told him the rhythm had found something to hold on to. The monitor confirmed what his hands already knew. Her oxygen saturation was climbing. He did not pause to acknowledge it, neither did anyone around him. The room was still a working emergency, and it was not finished. Electricians had gone into the sub-corridor basement at the start of setup. Gideon had not seen either of them come back up. Before going down, he radioed the 4th-floor nursing station. He kept his voice even and used the code for precautionary relocation. Not evacuation, not alarm, only the signal that meant move the ward patients to the interior corridor and wait for confirmation. The nurse on duty asked no questions. Within 2 minutes, the 4th floor would be repositioning its patients. Wherever the night went from here, that had been done. He pulled a half-mask respirator from the emergency kit, told Darius to stay with Sasha until the paramedics arrived, and went down through the service corridor alone. The basement sub-corridor was hot and dim, the emergency lighting casting everything in flat amber that made distances unreliable. The HVAC fans were still cycling, moving air through the passage in slow, heavy pulses. Gideon stayed low and followed the warmth. Not smoke yet, more the particular stale heat of insulation that has been cooking without flame, long enough to be very nearly past the point of without. He found the first electrician 8 meters in, sitting against the wall with his hard hat tipped forward and his hands open in his lap, the posture of someone who had tried to stand and quietly decided not to. Gideon got the man's arm across his shoulders and walked him to the base of the stairwell, where a security officer met them and took the weight from him. He went back. The second electrician was deeper in, near the junction boxes. He was conscious but grounded, unable to stand under his own direction. Gideon placed the respirator mask over the man's face, pulled him upright against the wall, and began moving him toward the stairs while the heat pressed against the back of his neck, and the edges of his vision did something deliberate and unwelcome. He made it to the stairwell. Paramedics met him at the top. Outside Rosedale Memorial, the November air arrived in a single clarifying wave. The street was blocked with ambulances and fire trucks and a cordon of police vehicles. The gala guests stood in borrowed coats and coats offered by strangers, their breath rising in white columns in the cold. Sasha was being loaded into an ambulance, breathing through a mask, her eyes partially open and tracking, which was everything. Gideon asked Darius for a head count. Darius confirmed. Gala guests, catering staff, the full medical team, both electricians, every member of event security. Every name on the building roster was accounted for. Gideon put one hand against the ambulance bay wall. His legs informed him, with the patient certainty of a long-deferred message finally delivered, that the conversation they had been attempting for the past 20 minutes was no longer optional. He sat down on the curb before the alternative chose itself. He was still sitting there when Hugh Fenwick arrived with 2 lawyers and a representative from the hospital's insurance provider. The investigation, Hugh said, would need to account for why a contract security officer had accessed restricted systems, issued undocumented warnings, and bypassed the chain of command during an active emergency. He suggested, with careful diction, that the pattern of Gideon's behavior that evening raised questions about his intentions. Gideon looked at him without speaking. Hugh said the CO detector on his belt was not standard issue for a security guard and asked where it had come from. Gideon said it had come from 11 years of learning that the people closest to a danger are often the last ones anyone thinks to ask. Hugh told him his access credentials were suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. 2 days later, a transaction appeared in a checking account connected to Vera's ongoing medical trust. A small sum, traced to a payment processing company Gideon had no relationship with. The hospital's legal team presented it as a potential conflict of interest. Police arrived at his apartment on the 3rd morning. Vera was home that day for the first time in 3 weeks, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-finished drawing of a house and a horse that was losing the structural argument. She looked up when the knock came and read her father's face before he had a chance to arrange it into something she might not recognize. He told her it was a misunderstanding, and he would explain it properly when he got back. She stood up from her chair and told him she already knew what had happened. A nurse on her floor had told her that the people in the gala had been sick, and that her dad had helped them. She wanted to know why they were taking him away for helping people. He had no answer for that. He knelt down, held her face in both hands for a moment, and told her to call her Aunt Brenda and to stay inside. Outside the building, a cluster of off-shift hospital staff and gala attendees had gathered on the pavement behind the police tape. Some had been in the function hall, some had been helped out of the corridor. Some had watched Gideon carry a man who could not walk up a flight of stairs while barely managing to stand himself. Vera followed to the doorway in her socks. She told the crowd, in a voice that was working very hard not to break, that her dad had been the one who figured it out, and that they should say something. Nobody moved. Gideon looked back at her once. Then he walked to the police vehicle and got in. Nadine Cote had been Rosedale Memorial's safety compliance officer for 6 years. She had attended the gala as part of her administrative role and had watched Gideon identify the contamination source with the particular close attention of someone whose entire job was to notice when official processes silently failed. She had pulled the internal logs before the legal team could request a system hold. The 3 warnings were there, time-stamped, documented, received by the operations system, and unacknowledged. Each one had been visible to Hugh Fenwick's administrative account at the time of submission. The HVAC damper adjustment that had increased airflow from the sub-corridor had been authorized from within the facility's management system 4 hours before the gala began, traced to a facilities account that had been reassigned without a proper audit trail. The electrical contractor confirmed, when Nadine reached him independently, that the grounding connections on the temporary junctions boxes had been flagged by his team during installation. A sign-off had come from the hospital's senior administration approving the installation to proceed without correction in order to meet the event deadline. He had the email chain. Nadine took everything to Darius Okonkwo that same evening. Hugh's team moved on the server room 2 days later. Nadine had anticipated it. The original system logs were already on a secured external drive at her home. The board convened a formal hearing. Sasha Merrill attended by video from her hospital room, pale, careful, and absolutely alert. Gideon walked into the boardroom in his security uniform, the one that had been washed too many times, and placed 3 printed pages on the table in front of the assembled directors, lawyers, and senior administrators. Each page was a copy of one of his warnings. Each had a timestamp. Each had been received and ignored. He did not make a speech. He asked one question. How does a hospital that named a wing after the courage of healing build a system in which the person closest to the problem cannot make himself heard? The room was quiet for a long moment. Nadine presented the recovered logs. Darius provided a formal statement from the electrical contractor and played the voicemail the contractor had left for the facilities manager the morning of the event, describing the grounding concerns he had never been called back about. The money in Vera's medical trust was traced within 48 hours to a numbered company connected to a service provider Hugh had used for personal consulting contracts. It had been deposited the night Gideon submitted his 3rd warning, not after the event, but before it. Hugh Fenwick was charged with criminal negligence causing bodily harm, falsification of safety records, and obstruction of an investigation. He looked toward the board directors when the officers entered the room. None of them met his eyes. Sasha was discharged 10 days after the gala. She came to see Gideon in the 4th-floor family lounge, where he was sitting with Vera during a monitoring appointment. She came without her assistant and without a prepared statement. She apologized. She said she had been told the safety reports were routine concerns that administration had already assessed. She said she should have read them herself. She said she was sorry. Gideon accepted the apology without filling the space around it with anything more than it deserved. She offered him full financial compensation for the suspension period, a settlement for his family, and any position at Rosedale Memorial he was willing to name. He declined the settlement. He said he wanted 3 things instead. A protected internal reporting system for safety concerns, one that could not be intercepted or altered by senior administration before reaching the CMO and the board directly. Mandatory carbon monoxide monitoring in every event space and temporary installation area across the hospital, and a hardship fund for single parents with children in long-term inpatient care administered independently of the executive team. Sasha agreed to all 3 without hesitation. She then offered him the position of Director of Safety Operations at Rosedale Memorial, with authority over emergency protocols, staff training, and the safety reporting infrastructure he had just described. Gideon looked at Vera, who was watching him from across the table with the expression she used when she already knew what he was thinking, but was waiting to see whether he would say it honestly. He told Sasha he needed to think about it. Taking the position meant returning to the kind of work he had stepped back from after Vera's mother died. Work where the phone could ring at 2 in the morning, and the answer was always yes. Vera had already lost one person who was always walking back into dangerous buildings. That evening, he and Vera ate dinner together in the family lounge because she was not yet cleared for discharge. She ate without saying much for a while. Then she said she did not want him to stop helping people, because she could tell it was still part of him even when he was pretending otherwise. She said she just needed him to promise that helping people would never become the reason she stopped being the first thing he came home to. He promised her that was not a trade he was willing to make. He accepted the position the following morning, with one condition of his own. His schedule would be built around Vera's monitoring appointments, school evenings, and hospital check-ins before anything else was placed in it. Sasha agreed. 4 months later, Gideon Baxter stood at the front of the Hartwell Cardiac Wing's main function hall, The same hall, cleaned and recertified, with proper grounding on every temporary installation and CO detectors mounted at every register. He was leading the hospital's first full emergency preparedness drill. The staff moved through the exercise with the focus of people who had watched an underprepared system nearly cost them everything, and had decided they were not willing to learn that lesson a second time. Darius Okonkwo stood near the back with his arms crossed. Sasha stood beside him. Vera sat in the front row in her school clothes, the cardiac monitor gone and a notebook open across her knees, writing down things she found interesting in the way she had written down things she found interesting her whole life, in her mother's dark, careful hand. The staff in that room no longer saw the man who had worked nights in a uniform that didn't fit the occasion. They saw the man who had read a room when the air turned wrong, who had gone back into a basement corridor after being suspended, who had stood before a board of directors with nothing but 3 sheets of paper and 1 question, and who had used everything that followed not to recover what he had lost, but to make sure the next person with something important to say could not simply be made to disappear. Vera looked up from her notebook when her father glanced over at her. She gave him a small, deliberate nod, the kind that means "I see you," and went back to writing.